It was like the same thing after the tsunami. Sri Lanka lost like 35,000 people, right? And yeah, and there were people who were in Sri Lanka is after the ceasefire, so there were tourists coming, right? So there were people in Sri Lanka who were there as tourists, right? And then they went back to their countries, and of course they didn't lose their homes, they didn't lose livelihoods, they didn't lose as many, like all of this. They in that way weren't as affected as much, obviously. But what happened in Sri Lanka is you're surrounded every day by people who have went through the same thing. They've also had loss, and over again through the next, like the many months, everyone tells their stories. Where were you? What happened? Who you lost, and you remember them, and you have ceremonies, and you're all there together having this experience, right? And so I would meet people years later that had been in Sri Lanka during the tsunami, and it had completely, it had kind of derailed their life because they went back to a place where no one understood that experience. Whereas if you're in a place where everybody's trying to get through on their day-to-day life and going through it together, there's a support system that you have for each other. You tell stories, you talk about what's going on, you know what I mean? And so it doesn't look like it looks on the news and it doesn't feel on a day-to-day basis as dramatic. It feels like we're all in this together and we're trying to get through this,
Wow. So where were you when the tsunami happened?
So the 2 years before that, I'd actually been on the beach. So it's the day after Christmas, right? So it's the day after Christmas, which is like the one day off, right? Like we worked crazy hours. And so it was like an actual day off. And the 2 years before that, I'd stayed on the beach. That year, I was staying about a kilometer inland, and I was learning how to surf. So you've met Steven, my partner, right? So at that time, I was learning how to surf, and we were going to get up in the morning. That we had a meeting in a village. There was a conflict between tourism and fisheries, and we were going to have a meeting in the village. We pushed that meeting back so we could go surfing in the morning. Okay. And when the alarm went off to go surfing,
Wow.
I was lazy, and I was like, well, maybe not today. Let's just turn the alarm off. And so we didn't go. And when we turned out to go towards that meeting in the village on the coast, people were running in and they were saying the waves came. No one knew the word tsunami, right? So they were all like, the waves came, and didn't have any idea what was going on. Like, could not figure out what was going on. Everything was down, like phones are down, everything's down. So we couldn't make it to that village, and we still couldn't figure out what was happening. And we ended up trying to get back to Colombo. It was hours before we finally understood what had happened. We got through to a radio, and it said something about Indonesia. And we're like, what could possibly be going on in Indonesia?
Wow.
We had no idea what was happening, right? But we lost people that we were supposed to be meeting with that day, people that we've been working with, because they made it to the village on time. We were really, really, really lucky.
So that was totally unexpected. They didn't see any, you know.
I think in places, so like in the Andaman Islands, where the traditional stories had passed through more, where there hadn't been like the same disruptions, everyone knew that if the sea went out, you run up to high ground, right? Like that had been passed along, and they had very few deaths. In Sri Lanka, the sea went out and everybody ran towards it. Like they were like looking at the fish and like trying to like, oh, look at this. And they all ran out towards it. People didn't know. Now, of course, people know. But it had been many years since there'd been a tsunami in the Indian Ocean of that scale. So that, people had no idea what was going on at
Wow, that's
first.
crazy.